I absolutely am excited about getting Luis and Teri into this conversation. They're fantastic people. I got a chance to meet them last week and prep a little for this, and I think we hope it's going to be a really interactive and fantastic convo. So what I'm going to do now is toss it over to Teri and let her share a little bit about who she is and what she does and how she arrived at this, and then we'll have Luis go ahead and do the same thing.
Perfect. So can you hear me? Good?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. So hi, everybody. So basically, my name is Teri Arvesu. It's so funny because you guys actually pronounce it, and I always do it more, in English, I feel, without the Spanish accent. My background is mostly in news and operations. I think what has helped me in this new role that I've taken on, that I took on last year, to build out a vertical that straddles the traditional CSR, our diversity and equity and inclusion efforts, our foundation, and then as a result of that, also the collection and the reporting and the creation of a strategy for ESG for TelevisaUnivision. What this is, I should point out that although Univision has been in this country for 60 years, we are a relatively new company because we merged in February with Televisa. And so this journey is one in which I think Univision, there's things in our DNA that just made us perfect for ESG, right? But we are also looking at it, one, from the US perspective, but then a global perspective as well. So it's a pretty big a job that we have here, and it feels like, it's in motion. We are getting it together. So that's my spiel.
Awesome. Luis, a little bit about yourself.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Teri. Thanks, Henry. Hey, everyone. Buenas. So I'm Luis. Hey, look, first and foremost, a little bit about me. I'm a proud husband and father and son and brother. And I'm super passionate about making the world a better place, right? I was born in Colombia, and I was raised in a bicultural and bilingual home in Northern Virginia in Arlington. And really, I think in my career, I've just tried to be intentional about giving back. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, how I wanted to. I just knew that I wanted to make a positive difference, right? And so I've, worked in NGOs. I've worked in government in the U.S. with the U.S. government. I was actually a foreign service officer. I worked at U.S. embassies abroad, and particularly in Latin America. And most recently, I've been working in the corporate world. So, I was at Walmart and at Nike, and now I have a great privilege of working at EA, Electronic Arts, which is a very large video game company. So I'm probably the coolest dad on the block with free games for the kids. But look, I think ultimately what we're trying to do in the ESG space, right, is we're trying to expand the positive power of play, right? And you can't spread or expand the positive power of play if, people's houses are getting flooded, right? You can't spread the positive power of play if there's only some that actually have access to making the games and buying the games and playing the games, right? It needs to be more inclusive. And you can't spread or expand the positive power of play if you don't have the unique assets and capabilities of your company and you're able to deploy them in the communities and make a difference, right? So happy to talk a little bit about our experience as well.
Awesome. Really excited. Thank you for that. So let's start with this, because we've all touched a little bit on this, and that's this idea of core values. You put it really well, Luis. We're all here trying to make the world a better place. And back to what I was saying earlier about the different industries we sit in, we each have different ways of showing up in the marketplace and in the world. So let's start with this idea of core values and how important it is to tie that with the impact we're trying to have. And maybe I'll start with this bit of a, not controversial, but within each of your organizations, how do you feel about how those values really line up with what the organization is doing? Like, is there really good alignment there? And if there is, like, what is the secret to why that alignment exists? And if not, how are you addressing that? Teri, let me start with you on that one.
I want to say yes, because I think, I often brag about the fact that while a lot of companies are trying to figure out what their mission is because they already exist as a company, one of the things I love, and I have been at Univision now, TelevisaUnivision, for 20 years, and I've spent my life in Spanish language media. is that we were really a mission before we were a company, right? And I feel like we were very early, right? Now everybody else is trying to figure out and catch up in that respect. And, maybe sometimes we forget that, right? But I do really think, that now is our value proposition, if we want to put it in those terms. But at the end of the day, we were created as a company to help Latinos advance in this country. And then I think the layer of media and news, where it is front and center, we know our brand. We make decisions based on whether, is this going to inform, is it going to entertain, or is it going to empower the Latino community? Like every decision that's at the core of what we do. It's just been ingrained in us since you started at Univision. That was and is our secret sauce. And so, and then I think we just attract people that come with that same level of passion. And so I have to say that, yes, it's at the center of every single person that comes to work here. It's why you come work here. It's why you stay working here, to advance really the role of Latinos in this country. So I have to say yes, 100%.
I love it. That's awesome. And you know what? It's interesting because, again, I'm insurance, you're in media, information. And then Luis, you're honestly the first person I've ever met that works for a gaming company. And I know the products you put out, but what about this values at a game? Like, you're a giant gaming company, right? Probably the biggest one maybe, but what about it at your organization?
Teri's making me want to work at Univision. It's great. Look, I think I'll maybe kind of be a little bit more meta about it, and then I'll kind of land it, hopefully. But I think it's a journey, and I think ultimately, when you speak of kind of values, we have a value. We have 8 values, right? We have purpose and belief value awards, and where we kind of actually heroize different staff that are really good in one of our values of creativity and teamwork and these types of things, right? So these are values that permeate through the organization, and there's some intentionality around it, right? There's diversity, equity, and inclusion is obviously a value of ours, and inclusivity. But what I like to say is that there is no finish line, right? To borrow one of my kind of Nike-isms when I was there, there's not. And if you asked people at our company if you think we're living out our values on some of those, they probably say yes, and on others they'd say there's probably some work to do, right? And I think we need to be kind of real about those, and I think it's our job kind of in the ESG space particularly to be able to surface that and to actually make it tangible and real, and come up with targets and come up with objectives and come up with how this is going to show up in performance reviews, how it's going to show up in bonuses, and how it's going to show up across the board. So for me, I think I think the company is a great company. I think it's full of passion and creativity and curiosity, and but I think there is no finish line.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love this idea of I would echo some of that, and I know Teri wants to jump in here, but one thing I would echo on that is this idea of a work in process, or work in progress. We're an insurance company based in Boston. Boston is not one of the most diverse cities in the United States. That is a fact. I've been here 11 years, and I've seen us go through a real transformation when it comes to how we think about our values and our purpose. We believe that we exist to help people embrace today and confidently pursue tomorrow, because we're about allowing people to take risks. And one thing that I feel good about what we're doing, and again, we've got a long way to go, is it doesn't sound glamorous, but I think we have paid a lot of attention to governance. And I just want to make sure that I get that point across, because again, secret sauce, like we all maybe have something, but again, not the most glamorous thing, but this idea of governance and who are the people that have been picked to sit around a table and think about these things and cascade and model the behaviors that we want and hold each other accountable. I think one thing we are doing well at Liberty is that we have involved at all levels of the organization in our governance structures a very broad swath of folks to sit at those tables to think about the issues that we need to worry about, how we're showing up, and the difference we're trying to make. DEI is a perfect example. We have a lot of executive level councils that include mid to lower level folks that sit there to talk about the pressure points, the pain points, the things that companies need to be paying attention to. And then one thing I'll say too is that Puerto Rican, I'm in my early 50s. I got a 22-year-old daughter that actually just started at Liberty a month ago. So I'm really proud that she's joined Liberty. She sees the world very differently than I do. How she shows up, the questions she's asking, honestly, are not things that I would have felt comfortable or brave enough to ask. So we're dealing with a different generation that expects some of these things to be table stakes. And I know we all know that. And I think it's an important point that the world's moved on, and what is expected of corporations and how corporations deal with these things has evolved and accelerated and keeps accelerating. So Teri, I know you're itching to get in here.
No. I mean, look, I think that what you're saying is absolutely true. And it is the reason that I think companies are focusing. It feels like ESG blew up, right, in the pandemic.
Yep,
After the
exactly,
pandemic,
yes.
and it's only getting bigger and more, and more important. Because at the end of the day, what we have to all recognize is that it adds so much value to the company itself. I think the evolution from corporate social responsibility to now what ESG is that it's taken what was a nice to do and maybe wasn't core to the business, and it's put this what we have to do in the center of our business. What? Because it adds value, and it adds value because I just was talking about Univision. You want to come work here, right? We're in the middle of a talent war. This is exactly, this is how you get the best and brightest talent to come in. The culture that you create for them while they're here means retention, and that has a top line and a bottom line value for the company, right? And and then obviously investors as well, clients in our case want to come work. People want to partner with you because also he who's not doing it, to the point of your daughter, like that's a risk. We now live in a world where I don't want to invest in your company if you're not doing the right thing. Because of that huge generation, and kudos to them. I think they're the ones that are going to change the world, and I'm super optimistic, and I hope they do. And I'm right there behind them and with them, right? Like, I don't want to buy products that are doing bad for society. I don't want to invest in companies that don't. I want the companies and the organizations and institutions that I belong to. And I think that what a lot of us, right, and this whole generation wants is that level of intentionality, right? That you see, and I was gonna, and I promise I'll just say this and then I'll stay quiet because I could talk about this all day, because as you can see, I love it because it's brought us front and center to the operation, and now it's paying us back, right? If we are doing the right thing. The other thing with Luis is, one of the things that we have in common is that, and media had to do this, especially journalists, right? When you go to school to study journalism, you are often taught about ethics, and it's about what image am I putting out there and how might I be stereotyping. So for a long time, we were doing that anyway. So all of this diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how am I using our platforms to relay a positive image to that audience and do something and contribute in a good way to society is something a lot of our newscasts were already thinking about. And now, Luis, I look at you and I think, like, sometimes gamers, that's not what they don't have that ethics class, right, in there when you're learning to game or to whatever program and stuff for gaming. And I think that it's really important right now that gaming have that as an intentionality, because you're making, for my children, you are crafting an image of themselves. If the guy who has dark skin is always the villain in the game, well, guess what you're doing? The same thing that I would have been doing if I would have talked about race in a newscast only when they were African American, right? So media, we have to take it really, really to heart, right? And so that's why it always felt very natural and core to me to take on this role, because there was a responsibility that I felt using our platform. So
So look, I want to
go ahead.
I want to talk about putting goals into actions real quick, but Luis, talk a little bit about that, right? Because you all, do you think about those things, and how do you try to inject sort of that DEI lens into that stuff? So.
No, of course, and actually, you know, it's actually the reason why I took this job, right? Because things were going great where I was at the Swoosh, you know, here in Portland. But you know, there was just this, you know, and I've got 3 kids, right? So I got a 10-year Santiago, Camila, and Lucho, right? 10, 8, and 3. And you know, my oldest, they play FIFA, they play the games that we make, they play Madden, and you know, and there was just this, you know, EA has 650 million players, right? A third of the global population plays video games, right? And it's only growing. I mean, it's entertainment, right? It's going from like kind of static entertainment to like interactive entertainment, right? And so I was like, okay, this is a cool industry I want to learn a lot about. And then it was like, okay, well, if you've got this platform, you're creating these virtual worlds, right? That now more than ever we're interacting in. And what's interesting about it, and what's really cool about it, to Teri's point, is that you can kind of create the worlds and the behaviors and the storylines of how things could be, right? So you can actually start to influence behaviors, right? Whether it's just even through characters and having thousands of skin colors and shades and different types of hair types, to storylines and plots. I mean, you get ESG involved, right? I mean, like there's like apocalypse games and what happens if you don't, you know, take care of the environment. I mean, it's limitless, right?
Yeah,
and so for me, what was really interesting was just this idea to come in and lead a function that would be able to hopefully make a positive social impact through these games, you know. Now I'm still learning them, right? But it's fascinating. And I think, you know, and so I came in, and it was funny talking about what social impact is. You know, I came in and I talked with 10 different leaders, you know, including our C-suite, about what my role is in my first week. And they all said something different. You're the head of social impact. You should be doing carbon's net zero stuff. Like you should be doing philanthropy. So anyway, I created an ESG function and did a materiality assessment and all that, you know, stuff. But then I kind of went into what I was really interesting for me, which was just this social impact through games. So that's kind of what I do. Last thing I was going to say is something that Teri brought up, which was kind of, you know, risk mitigation and kind of value and some other things. And I think we're all here because we believe in the power of this, right? We believe in the power, the transformational power that our companies can have, because we have unique assets and capabilities. I mean, we have games, you have, you know, insurance, you have media and entertainment, and all of you in the audience, I'm sure, have these just great kind of unique assets and capabilities in your companies. You can kind of bring them to bear on these seemingly intractable social environmental issues in a very unique way. Yeah. And I think what I want to make sure that we get across, though, is that for me, what is important is when we talk about this, we talk about it from a risk mitigation lens, yes, right? Like if you don't do this now, like you're going to get dinged by the SEC, right? Because of the environmental regulations. Okay, check. But there's another motivation, which was do the right thing. It's out of the goodness of your heart, because you're a good corporate citizen, and that's valid, right? There are people that appeals to, and that's a reason to do this work, is because you feel like it's aligned with your values, right? And you want to make a positive impact. You've got mitigation. But then there's the one that I think is really interesting, where ESG kind of gets into as well, which is adding business value, creating and adding business value where it wasn't there, right? So like when I was at Nike, one of the, you know, projects that I tangentially worked on was Nike Grind, which is the stuff that, like, it's basically excrement and waste from the factories where they make shoes. And then they put it back into shoes, right? They put it back into like the soles, and then they put it into kind of different things that you could commercialize. So with circularity, you weren't like, you know, wasting and polluting, you're putting it back in. So there was business opportunity and adding value in this work, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And as I listen to both of you, two things come to mind. One is we like to look at, and I love what you're saying we don't see this as like a compliance check thing. That's there's enormous business value in ESG, and anyone that argues against that, I would be hard pressed. Like they're sort of out of the loop, because from an insurance, so from an insurance perspective, as we think about the climate transition, so when we were talking about unique assets, we're in three very different industries. And I think one of the things I would just advise some of the folks on here, if you haven't already done it, and I'm sure you probably have, is that find what that superpower is for you as a company, because you play in an industry. You're either the largest or in the middle, whatever it is, that unique asset, like those are the levers you have to pull. So when we think about where we are, climate's a really, really big deal. And we want to align with companies that have credible transitions of their own. So we want to have good partners that are being very intentional about what they're doing. It's a reputational risk not to do that. But beyond that, for us, this climate transition is a huge business opportunity. So we have quantified with some outside consultants that as the world needs to decarbonize, the world needs to spend something on the order of like $4 trillion a year to convert to an energy system that is no longer primarily dependent on fossil fuels. For us, that means a lot of new things to insure, right? So there is, and it's great because there's business opportunity in this. And I think Teri was the one that was saying that now people are literally embedding sort of sustainability and ESG as integral parts of the business decision-making process. We have a long way to go there because a lot of it is complicated, and how do you identify what those ESG factors are and what's a risk, what's an opportunity, how do you quantify these things? So that's important. The other thing I want to say is we all as organizations put out these beautiful glossy reports that people can feel really good about, but I do think that there is a huge risk of being called out, like for example with greenwashing, right? Making commitments that when people start looking under the hood, you do not have the evidence to demonstrate that you're actually doing the things you're doing. So when we talk about things like decarbonization, for example, Liberty has very intentionally not, this is us not, put out sort of a net zero goal, because we feel there are challenges to how we would need to quantify that. So we're trying to first figure out quantification so we can comfortably then make those commitments. And then people that start looking under the hood, we can say, we can measure this and we can show you exactly how we're getting to where we're going. Now that's our industry. I know other industries have had a far, like more of a head start in figuring this out, and they're more comfortable doing that. So goals into actions, right? That goes from like that greenwashing bit that I was saying is, can you both comment on how you put these stakes in the ground and then hold yourselves accountable to your stakeholders, to yourselves, and disclose and report on these things? Teri, maybe you can start with that one.
So, I mean, in our approach this year, really because of the merger, has been more, I would say, in the United States, qualitative than quantitative, right?
Okay.
And and part of what also dictates that is that we're not publicly traded, right? I think it's a whole other set of expectations if you are, and we are also, waiting for the SEC to tell us, what those expectations are. So I have, when it comes to goal setting, we're not there. Our part of the journey is first the identification of what's already happening now. We don't have a huge carbon footprint, right, in media, maybe at our local stations and stuff, but it really isn't a lot. And a lot of decisions, and I'm saying this qualitatively, but like a lot of the decisions that are made when you start to do a new set or whatever, you're already thinking about those things, right? So one is, we are our journey is right now the collection of what's happening and finding any gaps, and then unifying and understanding what Mexico is doing, and then seeing how we bring that together, and then how we streamline the reporting of that. And we would not be sharing, we wouldn't be sharing. I mean, when we get asked from investors and stuff, we share whatever that they want, but it isn't something that we're coming out just yet. And part of the reason is that and I would recommend this for anybody because of what you were saying, which is, this is not a tagline where you could be like, oh, we're the happiest place in the world. Well, you know what? Someone's going to knock on your door and be like, prove you're the happiest place in the world, right? And I would recommend very highly that you are extremely conservative in that number, because you're going to, this is a generation that calls BS on these things, right? And so I would say be conservative. And then I know, because then I'm not able to talk, but I want to say one more thing before is that when we talk about, ESG, and it means different things to different industries, and we don't have this like universal measuring system, which
there's no standard. There's no standard.
There's no standard.
Right,
and it's hard because it's a hard thing that you can't paint with a broad stroke. But when you look at your business and you ask yourself, and someone gave me this advice, was actually one of our legal counsel, to think of ESG as the role you play in society. And then on another note, because like I love this generation and they're like so cool, and it's like, are you a part of the problem or are you a part of the solution? Right? Mm-hmm. If you can take those two principles and apply them to what you do, you'll be the best at ESG. Like you called it superpower. For me, it's that. And then if you can actually prove you're doing it authentically, then if that's where the business purpose, the value, it's going to be there. You know what I mean? First comes that, then follows the money.
Yeah. And I think, you don't want to don't gloss over the fact that maybe you're far away from getting to where you want to be. I think that's fine. A lot of times we're put on the spot and we're afraid to admit that we're far away from where we as an entity may want to be. And I think people appreciate when you do that. And I think that transparency is really important. I'm glad you hit this point about standards and rating agencies and all that. We disclose a lot of things, but then there are a lot of things that we're not ready to disclose with because the data is not really credible, and it's not because we don't have a good story. It's like the data may not be reliable. I will say this though, and I think maybe both of your organizations and other folks on the phone here can relate to this. Employees can be ambassadors, or they can also be whistleblowers, right? We have very active employees, very active DEI communities. We have a very active employee green community, they call the C, and they're constantly emailing us to say, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this other thing? And we have to have good answers. And I don't, you read in the headlines how companies that do go out there and go out on a limb without really being able to demonstrate these commitments with hardcore evidence, it's a big risk because sometimes your employees will call you out before anyone else does. And that's probably a bigger problem to have than a customer calling you out. But
hey, Henry, let me pick up on that. And I know we're going to get to questions.
Yeah.
But I agree with kind of the sentiment and what Teri was mentioning. It's an important point that you bring up because it's something that I've actually spent a lot of my time on recently. And it's the when stuff happens in the world, right? And when is your company going to come out and say something about it, right?
Yeah.
I've spent lots of time on that, over the last 6 months. And I think it's absolutely aligned to your ESG. I think anyway, it's aligned to where you're putting a stake in the ground in the areas where you as a company think that you can help move the needle in the environment and society. And that needs to be consistent with kind of which kind of issues and topics and current events you're actually going to come out on and be proactive about or be reactive on, right? And kind of calibrating what your response is going to be. Because, at the end of the day, you can't come out on everything and say you're going to, we'll spend, and then you get a lot of pressure from employees.
Well, people will call you out, right? Because you're speaking on something that you don't really have earned the right to really
you don't have the
speak on.
credibility. You don't have the credibility, business capability. Anyway, but it is an important point, and I, maybe on another call, just kind of thinking through kind of how different companies are kind of aligning their posture and or their positioning, their public positioning with their kind of ESG and kind of long-term commitments around how they're going to, make the world and make their business better.
Totally agree with that. That alignment has to be there. I think that, we haven't gotten to half the questions that we thought we'd get to, but this is great. I think it's going really well. We do want others now to kind of jump in here. We want to give other people on the call a chance to chime in. And, and ask away, or share based on what you're hearing, maybe some tidbits from your own organizations and how you're positioned and what you're doing along these lines. So I think what we said is folks can feel free to please sort of turn the mic off and introduce yourself, the organization you're with, and ask away, comment away, react, whatever it is you want to do. So please feel free. And unfortunately, I can't see if someone's wanting to say something. So
you guys hear me?
yes, Alan, go right ahead.
Yeah, it's pronounced Alon, but yeah, good to be
Alan,
here
I'm
with everybody.
sorry.
Yeah, there's an accent on that second A. This is interesting. And so full disclosure, so I'm Alon Bonilla, I'm based in California, San Francisco Bay Area. I work for S&P Global Ratings. You mentioned the rating agency. So I work for one of the rating agencies, and my job is to, I work on the sustainable finance team, and my job is to analyze companies' ESG footprint, what they say about sustainability. That's what I do for a living. And I've been doing ESG and sustainability for about 15 or so years in different capacities.
Mhm.
And so this is somewhat of a loaded question, but I'm interested, right? Like a lot of companies are in early stages of their ESG journey, right? And this is becoming increasingly important to Teri's point on ESG not being no longer a nice to have, but you must have it and demonstrate that to your stakeholders. I'm curious if you're able to answer for each of you, like, what is it, right? That for Liberty Mutual, for Televisa, and for Electronic Arts, but what was the moment, or what was the events or things that happened in the last few years? I know each of you have sustainability reports, which I just took a glance at, but what was it as an impetus to say ESG matters for Liberty Mutual? Now we're going to disclose sustainability reports, and this is becoming was there an event or a series of events, and when that happened?
Yeah,
I know it's pretty
so-
loaded, it might be difficult to answer, but I'm curious.
Yeah, no, I think, Alana, I could answer on behalf of Liberty, because I think that when I started speaking, right, we felt pretty confident that we were doing ESG. And what we weren't doing was telling the story of ESG at Liberty, because our investor relations group had elements of it. We had our other parts of our finance organization that had elements of it, our underwriting, investing organization. It was so fragmented that for us, what happened was, I want to say it was about maybe 4.5 years ago, our more senior leaders got together and did an assessment of, every 5 years they do this, like, what are the strategic imperatives that we need to think about, and formally start sort of embedding in the narrative that we pay attention to and how we talk about these things. And we were getting a lot of questions from S&P, Moody's, starting to get investors. We're not a publicly traded company, but we raise corporate debt. And there was a trend going up where more and more people were going to these presentations, and folks like you were asking, what's your position on this? And we're like, you know what? This is a thing. We need to formalize it, because we were doing it a lot. And that's my point, in different pockets. But what was missing was who's pulling this all together, adding it all up, and then communicating it. So we weren't telling the story. We weren't pulling together the data. So that was one thing. And then the other piece was, once we started telling the story, we're like, well, for it to be credible, we should research and align ourselves and adopt one of the widely accepted frameworks. So we went with GRI, we went with SASB, because again, you can have the narrative and the beautiful glossy brochures, but are you disclosing what some of these frameworks are expecting you to disclose? So 3 years ago, we said, if we're going to start telling the story and issuing a formal ESG report, we should adopt some of the frameworks, gather the data, and start disclosing. And every year, we disclose a little bit more. So depending on where the data is, how comfortable we are. So we've really been on that journey. So
Thanks.
I can chime in. I think that the pandemic accelerated a lot of things. And so the need to be able to see how, and I'm just going to say this as a broader level, it just happened to coincide also when, the person who was our chief brand and impact officer understood that this was something of great value to the company, and said, I want to put all these things together. And then, to her credit, we knew that in order for it to, or she knew, in order for it to actually take hold, it needed to be something that, like, our team looks both externally and internally, right? we were looking sometimes at the community as external, and they didn't fall. And then what about our community, like our own employees, right? So we're trying to create, and it's a process, in a very transformation within our company, is that there is that level of congruency across the board, because that's what's going to make it bulletproof. But the other part that I think also kind of maybe went a little under the radar, and I'll be very honest with you, I don't know if it played a role in her decision to make it, or it simply was her seeing that more and more investors cared about this. I think the roundtable in 2020, and also Larry Fink saying, BlackRock is not going to invest in any companies that don't have an ESG strategy. I think a lot of the accountability has been, for those of us, at least, or not for those of us, because I don't find myself in that pocket, but for those people who do it because they have to do it to mitigate risk, for those people, or those people who are looking to invest, and maybe they do it for that reason. I don't do it for that reason, but I think that has helped to really force across the board in any company. I'm not speaking about TelevisaUnivision. I think we do it for the right reasons, but everybody else is kind of like said, I think it's part of the explosion has been the round table.
Thank you.
So it sounds like we're out of Henry, Teri, and myself. It sounds like I'm the only one that works at a publicly traded company. So Teri's point is salient, right? I mean, I wasn't at EA 2.5 years ago when we came out with our first impact report, but so I can't speak to that. But my understanding is that there's been a lot of questions and pressure from investors, and for a lot of good reasons. I mean, investors have they help finance EA and all of our companies, and they're institutional investors, and so that's a big incentive. But I think when I came in, we had already had one impact report, and what I wanted to come in is actually, to Henry's point, come in and try to organize it and put some structure to it, right, and actually create an ESG function, right. And so the different internal structures, and start to kind of get to a little bit more methodical about how we were getting to what we were getting to, starting to come out with some goals. And we're in that process right now of goal setting. So as a company in our journey, our ESG journey, we're probably pretty on the front end, where we just completed a materiality assessment, and we're getting, all of the internal support for what we're doing, and kind of saying what is important for the business and society, and what's material. And so we're having all of those conversations. But ultimately, I think that might have been the catalyst, but there are other things that are continuing to kind of keep that momentum going. And I would say this, for all of us as ESG or corporate purpose or corporate social responsibility, whatever, practitioners, one of the things that I try to preach is patient urgency. And in that the results are going to come over a longer period of time, and particularly in a publicly traded company, that's tough, because you're trying to kind of hit that next quarter. You've got earnings, you've got comps, and all these different types of things. So you have to be patient, right, to actually see the fruits of your labor. But you also have to be urgent in terms of the ESG practitioner, in terms of having an urgency to move the processes forward and keep the momentum going for these projects, right? That's the urgency that I think you have to have in a large company like ours, where the goals, you're not going to be able to see them, and outcomes, you're not going to see them for a little while.
Right away. Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. We had a question in the chat from Mark Diaz. So thank you, Mark, for the question. It's, how is ESG changing your business partnership activities? Like, for example, relationship with suppliers, customers, talent, that sort of thing. So Teri, what about at TelevisaUnivision? How do you maybe pick one of those and talk a little bit about how you're focused on that?
I mean, I think first of all, that because of what I said at the beginning, like, there is a sense of values within all of our employees, that what I found is that a lot of people were doing it anyways. Like, we had a supplier diversity program that existed before I got here, right? And championed by people who obviously cared enough to care about it. How has it changed? I think there's a couple things when I think about the different stakeholders I mentioned and the value they bring. I think especially in two areas, there's enormous potential. Then it's changed. Like we're seeing even more growth, but I think there's even more growth to come. One is clients. Clients are trying to, a lot of the people who advertise with us or who do partnerships, because, we don't just do spots and dots and you run a commercial, but we do actual programs, actual campaigns with clients. They're being held accountable for the things we're talking about here. And so they don't understand how to talk to a diverse community, or in our case, Latinos. And we fill that void, I think, very well, and to do it authentically. The second one is, and to Luis, I completely agree with you. I think some of this stuff, there's the really long-term stuff. And then, my team has built out a lot of short-term wins as we start building out the longer ones so that people start to see the immediate value. And I wondered whether people were seeing it. And I got this. And so we did this whole ESG thing with a exercise with one of our investors, their entire portfolio. And I get a call like last week and they're like, I want to talk to you. And I'm like, oh my God, am I in trouble? Like, what happened? Like, what? And they're like, no, actually, the thing is that your company position is so strong that we want to highlight you guys in a retreat. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, I must be doing something right.
That's awesome.
Doing something right. I'm like, we're being called out. And where I always, we had this conversation when we prepped for this call that I'm like, any of you guys feel like you have imposter syndrome here? Because I do. And then, and so that was an immediate, what is it quantifiable at this point? No, I'm still getting there, but when your investors are calling because they want to call you out, that's the level of authenticity you're looking for. And to your point, like Henry, you talked about the story, right? Look, the rankers have to be there. You need to get you need to get those things that maybe some investors don't understand the touchy-feely, and you got to get there because they're like, oh, I get it. They're doing the right thing. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
What's going to convince people that there is enormous growth, is your financials, obviously your financial statement, but then the story that comes with it and makes it real, right? And so that was the proof for me that the value can sometimes be immediate, and that, anyways, to your question, no?
I love that. And I think, from my perspective, we're highly committed to DEI. We've been on this 9-year formal journey where we have an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. But to Mark's point, Mark, on the talent side, for the very first time, I want to say last summer, maybe last spring of 2021, Liberty put numbers, representation goals, DEI representation goals in the US anyway, together, targets, and published them. I mean, they spent a lot of time scrubbing the data and saying, from a Latino perspective, where are Latinos in this organization? At what level? And the numbers came back and the organization said, this is not good enough. We don't have enough senior Latino leaders at this grade level and above. In our organization, we have grade levels. I know everyone has some kind of HR system to figure out how you're promoting people, the practices that you have. So we've been working a lot on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we finally put numbers behind some of those efforts. So that changed. I think that all of that racial unrest that the country experienced in 2020 was a major catalyst for our senior leaders to revisit and think about DEI. And that led to some tough conversations we've been talking a lot about programs and education and raising awareness and educating each other about difference and how we celebrate diversity. But what about the numbers? So we literally set representation goals that we now publish publicly and hold ourselves accountable to and are tracking. So I think that's a big deal. And the other thing I think on the talent side is, and a lot of your organizations may already be doing this, but we started making sure that for certain jobs, we require that the panel of interviewees that are presented by managers to look at people include people of color, Latinos, African Americans, Asians, females, from a gender perspective. Tougher on the LGBTQ plus side because people have to self-identify, right? And that's not always something that people are comfortable doing. But those are the kinds of things we're doing to back up some of our aspirations. So I know we're at 5:58 here. And we can go, like Teri said, talking about this forever. And I do love listening to you both talk about what you're doing. I'm really happy that we've had this conversation. I hope everyone that joined the call has gotten something out of it. There's a lot for us to do. I do think that Luis put it really well when he said that each organization we sit in sort of has a unique value proposition, a unique set of assets, where they sit, what industry that you can bring to bear on having positive social impact. And I think that's something that we all need to keep in mind. And are we really thinking about what are we uniquely positioned to do? What is the work that our organization, if it were to disappear tomorrow, the world would be missing us because we leave that hole. And I think it's important that we recognize that and focus on the strengths and the levers we have to make a difference. So I want to thank you. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to hand it back to Michelle maybe, or maybe we just wrap it up with this bit, but I don't know if Michelle's still on, if she just wants to say a quick word before we hit 6 o'clock here.
Thank you so much. This was such an insightful conversation. I have so many notes and many questions. So hopefully we can do it again sometime, but thank you everyone for joining us. If there's any last minute housekeeping issues, Jill, let us know, but otherwise you will hear from us for the next event. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Adiós.